Hi, everybody. Thanks for attending. My name is Sarah Abernathy. I'm the Executive Director of the Committee for Education Funding. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan coalition of almost 120 education associations and institutions and others that represent the range of the education continuum from early ed through K through 12, through higher ed, through career technical adult education and out of school educational services. And together we advocate for a greater federal investment along that education continuum. One of the ways that we think that the best way we can make the case for education funding is to talk about what the funding accomplishes and why, in this case, some of the changes that are happening we think are not a good thing and what the results will be. So today we have a panel of experts on five different areas of education who will talk briefly uh, about the interagency agreements struck that the Department of Education has struck, in this case with the Department of Labor, to move almost half of the total funding for the Department of Ed to be managed by Department of Labor staff, and what that might mean for these programs and for the services, and also what some of our concerns are. And we also have here my colleague Jamie Panarides from CEF, who's running the webinar, and CEF's president Frank Ballman, who is going to moderate some Q&A. So after all the speakers have gone. So if you've got some questions that you'd like to have them answer, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A box. And I know a couple people have a hard stop right at 3, so we will endeavor to be done by then. I wanted to very briefly just sort of give an overview of where we are in the education funding world right now. The first thing I want to say is that this last year has been filled with a lot of chaos and uncertainty for education, for programs, for funding levels, for staff, for the flow of funding, the fact that a lot of the executive orders change priorities and the way funding is provided. They obviously don't change the underlying law. They can't. There are statutes that govern how programs are authorized and where they're managed. And there's appropriations law that says how much funding is provided for each program. But the Department of Ed has not been entirely transparent about what funding it actually provided for fiscal year 25, which is over. And for fiscal year 26, Congress has not yet enacted funding levels. So we're operating on a continuing resolution through the end of January that keeps funding at last year's levels, but last year's levels were also on a full year continuing resolution, and the instructions were to keep funding at the same level as fiscal year 24. But we know the department for a lot of programs said that it had the authority to move money from one program to another within an account at least, and they did that. They've also this fall already they've put out a lot of these. They delayed funding through the year. They withheld some funding. They ended funding for some programs. So, and then on top of that, Congress enacted a reconciliation bill on July 4th that made some pretty dramatic changes in cuts to student loan programs and cuts to Medicaid and SNAP that support some of the students who are at schools and provide funding for schools. And they also provided a tax credit for private school vouchers. So those programs, those changes have had a large impact on the flow of education funding. Congress right now is faced with some very different proposals for fiscal year 26, which technically started a few months ago. The president and the House Appropriations Committee have put forward proposals that would cut Department of Ed funding by $12.5 billion. That's a 15% cut. The Senate Appropriations Committee put forward a proposal that it passed on a strongly bipartisan basis that would essentially keep funding even at the 24 and therefore also the 2025 level, since that was supposed to be the same as the 2024 level, with a few exceptions. The one of the things that we are at pains to make clear is that the changes at the Department of Ed, laying off half the staff, withholding and transferring funding, efforts to close the department entirely, efforts to cut funding really dramatically. None of these are things that the public says it wants. When asked, the public, on a strongly bipartisan basis, says that they support more, not less, funding for the Department of Education. So I'm hopeful that Congress will hear what their constituents have to say and will at least maintain funding. We have a lot of information on our website, and I'll put some links to that in the chat. But I wanted to, I think what I'll do is pass it on to each of the panelists to introduce themselves and then to talk a little bit about the different programs we have represented here today, which are rural education, Title I, which is the department's largest K-12 program, historically Black colleges and universities, career technical education, and adult education. I think I covered everybody here. So with that, I will turn it to Melissa Sadorf to introduce herself and take it away.
Thanks, Sarah, and good afternoon. As Sarah said, I'm Dr. Melissa Sadorf. I'm the Executive Director of the National Rural Education Association, and we're an organization that elevates rural voices and advocates for rural schools and communities, and we do it by staying close to what's happening on the ground in districts of every size in every one of our rural regions. So I'm here today to bring a rural perspective on what happens when federal education functions are fragmented or relocated or disruptive. And I want to say this plainly. For rural schools, stability is not a luxury. It is the system we rely on. And when that system gets shaky, rural districts feel it first and they feel it hardest because we don't have layers of staff to absorb confusions or delays or shifting compliance demands. Over the last year, our executive committee members have been gathering direct input from superintendents about the federal funding delays, IDEA uncertainty, and broader restructuring proposals. And the findings have been consistent across all states. Late notices and shifting timelines don't create just an inconvenience. They disrupt hiring, they stall intervention planning, they delay contracts for services, and they freeze professional learning. In one case, a rural superintendent described federal uncertainty as one of the major factors contributing to a school closure decision in the 25-26 school year. So that's not just theoretical, that's about a community losing its school. So the rural reality is that many of our districts run lean by necessity, and that federal programs person might also be the curriculum coordinator, the testing director, and the one that helps cover the front office when somebody's out. So when responsibilities move across agencies, what you've done is multiply points of contact, you've multiplied reporting pathways, and you've multiplied the time it takes to get answers that used to come through one clear channel. So that's not streamlining for us, it's fragmentation. IDEA is the clearest example of why this matters. Rural special education has high fixed costs and limited staffing options, and we can't shop around for providers like large metros can. We can't create a specialized unit overnight. So when guidance changes or oversight becomes unclear or timelines start to slip, the impact lands directly on students with disabilities and the teams who serve them. And when IDEA funding or delivery becomes unstable, rural districts don't have slack in the system to buffer it. So the result is fewer services or delayed evaluations, staffing churn, and increased legal and compliance risk, on top of the reality that rural districts already carry a disproportionate number trying to meet the same requirements with fewer people. But it's not just about special education, it's about the full rural funding ecosystem. REAP supports that make staffing and interventions possible, title programs to keep instructional support steady, and rural community stability issues like rural schools, where instability doesn't just affect classrooms, it affects roads and emergency services and the viability of entire counties. If the goal is better outcomes and better efficiency, the rural path forward is not to break the system into smaller pieces. It's to protect clear lines of accountability, keep regulatory expertise where it belongs, and reduce burden through smarter reporting, consistent timelines, and strong technical assistance, especially for our small, rural, and tribal districts. And now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Kay Rigling.
Thanks, Melissa. My name is Kay Rigling. I retired 2 years ago after 44 years in the Office of the General Counsel at the U.S. Department of Education. For my entire career, I provided legal advice on Title I. So my observations today are based on my personal experience working on Title I and my relatively limited knowledge of the MOU with labor. I in no way am representing the views of the Department of Education. And I'm premising my observations on the assumption that the remaining Title I staff, which has already been decimated by early retirements, buyouts, and resignations, will relocate to labor. In other words, that's the best case scenario. In the event that folks continue to leave, the situation for Title I program implementation will become more dire at labor because there'll be fewer knowledgeable staff able to perform the necessary functions and provide assistance to states and school districts. So I'd like to address 4 concerns. The first is administration of Title I by labor. It's my understanding that the MOU would assign administration of Title I to labor. Administration is a pretty broad, nebulous word. So depending upon how it's defined, it could mean little change in how the Title I program operates, or it could have far-reaching ramifications. If the Title I staff is merely housed at labor, but continues to operate under the direction of political appointees at Ed, the program could operate as it did remotely during COVID. So there'd be lots of Teams calls with necessary staff at Ed, but the program expertise would remain within the Title I staff. To the extent, however, that labor takes a more hands-on approach, it could create havoc. Labor has no knowledge of the Title I program, the history of statutory interpretations, the guidance that's been provided, or the statutory or regulatory requirements. If the supervisory staff at labor approves decisions before they can be implemented, either alone or in conjunction with Ed staff, there could easily be a logjam that would slow or halt all program implementation. With respect to Title I funding, as you know, the 4 Title I formulas are complex. Each has different eligibility criteria and statutory requirements. We have successfully implemented those formulas remotely during COVID. So at best, the transfer to labor could continue to enable them to be implemented by Title I staff without any cause for concern. However, it's more than likely that there will be glitches. Title I staff rely on multiple contracts and other entities to provide the data necessary for the Title I formula. There's outside contacts for preparation of state per pupil expenditure data, an MOU with the Census Bureau to provide population and poverty data. States provide neglected and delinquent data, and the Department of Health and Human Services provides data on foster children. Not to mention that NCES, which has also been decimated, must provide new IDs for new school districts to be included in the formula. If any of these data sources is delayed or impaired, the formula can't be calculated. So adding labor to the mix could create yet another layer for hiccups and consequential delays. Additionally, it's my understanding that the funds for 2026 will be awarded through Labor's grant-making system. Grants for 2025 and prior years were awarded through ED's G5 system. As a result, grantees will need to deal with, at the same time, with funds awarded under two separate systems administered by different agencies, which likely will create an accounting nightmare that could put states and grantees at high risk. The third thing I'd like to mention is the purpose of the MOU. One purported purpose of moving Title I programs to Labor is to better connect Title I and workforce development programs. Title I, however, operates primarily in elementary schools in order to raise the achievement of low-achieving students. Its focus is not to upgrade the skills industry demands, although certainly higher achievement would ultimately lead to improved skills. And the fourth thing I'd like to address is the ability for the Title I program to provide timely technical assistance. Title I does not operate in a vacuum. Staff have always collaborated with staff in other offices that will likely remain at ED, such as the Office of the General Counsel, which has also been decimated, the Office of Non-Public Education, the Office of Special Education, and the Budget Office, to name a few. The move to Labor will make such collaboration much more difficult. Moreover, the move of programs that affect Title I students to other agencies, such as Indian Ed programs to Interior, will compound coordination difficulties. Where does a parent, a teacher, or a district go for resolution of an issue with an Indian child who has a disability in a Title I school? Do they go to Interior? Do they go to Ed? Do they go to Labor? And which agency resolves the matter? Coordination will be very, very difficult and will take too long. So in sum, there seems to be little upside and considerable downside in moving the Title I program to Labor. And ultimately, it's the students in our great nation that will not be well served. So I'll turn it over to Victor.
Hello, everyone. Victor Santos. I am the Associate Vice President for Government Relations at the Thurgood Marshall College Fund. The Thurgood Marshall College Fund represents mostly publicly supported historically Black colleges and universities. It makes up about 80% of the students who attend HBCUs. One of the interagency agreements that was signed was with the Office of Post-Secondary Education. The Office of Post-Secondary Education houses HBCU Title III Part B funding, as well as the master's programs for HBCU funding, the Historically Black Graduate Institution funding, as well as direct appropriations for Howard University, which is one of TMCF's member schools. We've had several conversations with the department as well as with the White House about our concerns with this, with the interagency agreement. The main concern was, going in, the Department of Labor has no experience with our program. Each HBCU has a Title III coordinator, and those Title III coordinators work very closely with the department, submitting their data, making sure that they're spending the funds the right way. There's regulations around how those funds are spent. And we want to make sure that those folks, if we're going to have a transition, that those folks will remain in place. I do have some positive news on our end, from our perspective, that we did get confirmation in writing from the White House and from the Department of Education that those folks who are currently working on HBCU issues will be detailed to the Department of Labor, and that they've instructed our folks to continue to work directly with them. And so that was actually a hint of good news from our perspective. to make sure that there are no balls dropped whenever this process begins. Again, we're not certain exactly when this transition will happen. It has not been communicated to us as of yet. But we are, glad that at least that will not be impacted by this transition. So I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have about this transition for HBCUs during the time of Q&A. But for now, I'll go ahead and pass it to Braden. To Braden.
Hi, my name is Braden Getz. I'm a senior policy advisor at New America, a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank. Before I joined New America, I worked for 26 years for the Department of Education, primarily on career, technical, and adult education. When I joined ED, CTE was known as vocational education, and it was not well regarded. It was considered, it was teaching a narrow set of skills for specific jobs, many of them low wage. Since then, CTE leaders and policymakers have worked hard to rebuild CTE, to create programs that teach durable skills to students, that prepare them for college and career. Moving Perkins to DOL, as has happened, threatens that progress. Congress made improving the technical and academic skills of students the core purpose of Perkins. Achieving that in K-12 requires integrating CTE with other middle and high school education programs, aligning it with state academic standards, and tightly connecting it to public higher education. That won't happen if Perkins gets stuck at DOL. So the rollout of the Perkins program transfer has been chaotic. On September 10th, state agencies were abruptly informed that Ed had transferred the FY25 Perkins appropriation to DOL, and to access their grants, states would need to go through DOL systems. While Ed has a single grant management and payment system, DOL uses two, one to transmit information about the grant and the other that's used by grantees to draw down their grant funds. Getting into that second system requires navigating a complicated multi-step process that involves getting pen and ink signatures, including one from the manager of the state agency's bank. Judging from last week's Ed press release, where they talked about 43 states having access to the grant funds, that means there are at least 14 that don't, counting the territories in DC. And that's 3 months later, 14 agencies still struggling to get through this system to get access to their grant funds. In terms of staffing, Ed removed the Perkins program leadership team and reassigned them to federal student aid. The remaining Ed employees who work on Perkins were encouraged to volunteer to go to DOL on a detail. Most agreed and are working there now. These Ed staff continue to be the liaisons to state agencies, but they're very anxious that what they do is being carefully documented so that Ed can transition these activities to DOL or to contractor staff. The taxpayers are paying extra for all this chaos. In mid-September, Ed and DOL signed an addendum to their IAA in which Ed agreed to pay DOL more than $1 million for its work on the Perkins and adult education programs through the end of FY26. That price tag is a concern because that's a large amount of money to find in Ed's administrative services budget. It creates pressures for layoffs to generate the money that Secretary McMahon is going to need to pay DOL for this transfer. And if it costs $1 million to administer two relatively simple, mid-sized formula grant programs, just imagine what it will cost to administer a huge program like ESEA Title I or complex competitive grant programs like the TRIO programs. I really am worried how Secretary McMahon is going to find those dollars. Now I'd like to hand it off to Jeff Fantine from the National Coalition for Literacy to tell us about the status of adult education.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, good. I have to put my notes up because good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Fantine. I'm the Executive Director of the National Coalition for Literacy. NCL is an alliance of mostly national organizations that support the field of adult education, adult and family literacy, and English learning. Our focus is to promote supportive state and federal policy, increase awareness about not only the state of literacy in America for adults, but also the value of adult education and literacy services, and expand access to effective services. I was asked to speak today primarily about the Ed DOL workforce partnership through the interagency agreement that was announced, I think, in July and implemented in late September, that shifted the administration of WIOA Title II, which is AFLA, the Adult Ed and Family Literacy Act, from Ed to DOL, and what the impact that has had on adult education. There's a lot of opinions about the impact. The transition from our field. I decided to reach out, use one of our NCL members, NASDA, the National Association of State Directors of Adult Education, reach out to state directors. As a former state director myself, I felt like they were the most directly, they're the group that could most directly speak to the impact that this transition has had, at least so far. I do want to preface the remarks. It's hard. There's been a lot that has happened over the last 10 months by the administration that has impacted adult education, so it's difficult to know what specifically has caused certain impacts. For example, it's already been mentioned, but the reduction in force has taken the staff of the Division of Adult Ed and Literacy, which is the department within Octay that administers the AFLA program, from 23 to what our best guess is 4 people remaining. And that includes the elimination of the entire team of regional coordinators who provided technical assistance and monitoring to states. So you can imagine taking a staff from 23 to 4, how that will impact being able to fulfill the duties of the AFLA program at whether it's in Ed or DOL. The other thing that happened was the withholding of the release of funds was supposed to happen on July 1st. I think states were notified on June 30th that pending an OMB review that the funding would be withheld. And even though the funding was finally released a few weeks into July, it did cause an impact. Many states paused or canceled their services. Some states had to terminate staff and instructors. Some instructors bailed because if they weren't sure that they were going to start at the beginning of the program year, they needed to go find a job, another teaching job elsewhere. So it did cause a lot of concern and unnecessary administrative burden as states were trying to figure out what they were going to do if the funding didn't come through. And then the government shutdown happened in October at a time when states were coordinating the submission of their NRS data for the 2024-25 program year, which impacted technical assistance and guidance to states when they had issues submitting data. And then we had the transition of the administration of AFLA to DOL through the interagency agreement, which detailed the 4 remaining staff at DAL over to the Department of Labor. I think within the ETA, the Employment and Training Administration, I think that's where they're housed. And it shifted the drawdown of AFLA funds from the ED system to the DOL system. And I think, as that was just mentioned, the same with CTE. The administration has been touting that this interagency agreement has been, actually, I saw a LinkedIn post the other day, largely successful. But at least from the AFLA perspective, that's not what states are really expressing at this time. Most state directors said it's too new. I mean, it was implemented in late September. It was immediately followed by the shutdown. And so they don't really know how it's going to affect yet. They haven't gotten a lot of communication and guidance about what specifically is going to change, if anything, who to contact, things like that. So the big narrative across, state director input was that it's too new, but there's concerns. And like was just mentioned, many states did indicate that they had difficulty with the transfer of the grant payment system over to DOL. And there were several reasons for that. There's a different way of providing narrative around expenditures, which they had no guidance on how to do that. And banking systems were titled differently within the 2 systems. So there's been a lot of confusion, and a lot of states have not been getting their funds. But I do want to say that Once the shutdown was over, Octane did provide a webinar to states to work through some of these issues, and it does appear over the last several weeks that they're trying to mitigate these issues, but it still has caused a lot of uh, issues with states getting their funding on time. The other issue that was expressed was the lack of communication and guidance, having no communication at all from Department of Labor since the transition has happened, not knowing what specifically is happening with the AFLA program, particularly with the national activity initiatives, and no one to contact with technical assistance needs. However, Octane is providing a shop talk tomorrow. The shop talk is they were happening, I think, on a quarterly basis prior to this current year. Um, and it's where the Division of Adult and Literacy communicates with state directors, providing updates, guidance, addressing issues, and things like that. And there's only been, I think, one this year, but the second one is tomorrow. It does appear, when I looked at the slides of what they're going to go through, that they're going to address some of these issues in terms of who's doing what with the staff. And they're going to talk about the status of the National Activity Project. So hopefully there'll be some more regular communication about that. Just overall, in terms of this transition, in theory, it does seem logical. The transition, what we hear from them a lot is AFLA is a core program under WIOA, which is a workforce program. So having AFLA in ed causes a coordination burden. I think I heard that before from them. And then having AFLA under DOL better aligns adult education services to workforce preparation and employment outcomes. However, it's important to remember that AFLA is an education program that provides critical foundational literacy and numeracy skills, English language acquisition, and civics education before job training can be effective. Short-term job placement without a solid foundation of basic skills, which is paramount to the whole rationale for why they kept it in ed during, it's in the summary of the bipartisan WIO bill back in 2014. The foundation of basic literacy skills leads to poor retention and limited wage growth. So if short-term job placement is their goal, which is what they've expressed, it's not good for long-term economic mobility, in our opinion, as a field. Administering AFLA through the U.S. Department of Education ensures that adult ed remains a core part of our nation's educational system, not just a workforce program. Housing AFLA at ed protects its mission, and the mission of adult ed is broader than workforce. It's to help adults improve their basic skills so they get good jobs, can support their families, and participate in their communities. It promotes equity for learners with the greatest needs and strengthens alignment with K-12, community colleges, and career pathways. At the same time, WIO requires strong coordination with the Department of Labor, allowing adult ed to support workforce goals without sacrificing educational quality or access. This balanced approach, again, directly from the summary of WIOA, builds strong long-term economic mobility, not just short-term job placement. And so that's been the overall sentiment from the field, is that it should remain in education because it's an education program, and adult ed is more than just workforce preparation. I also want to just take a few minutes to address the concerns that adult education field has with the way the administration views the communication and communicates about adult ed in their effort to validate its rationale for eliminating funding for adult ed. One is that AFLA is a program that incentivizes illegal immigration by providing English language services to immigrants. It's important to remember that AFLA is authorized by statute to provide English language services and is not authorized to collect immigration status. Another thing we've been hearing, AFLA should be eliminated because it's duplicative. AFLA served 1.26 million students in the 23-24 program year, the most recent year that we have data for, which is 3 times as many participants of any other core WIOA program, and co-enrollment across programs is only 6%. There is no indication that AFLA is duplicative. The other piece of the duplication is that of all the programs that provide high school credentials for adults. Since 2016, over 640,000 high school credentials have been obtained by adults via the AFLA program. There is no other program that has issued near that number, even when you add them all up together, of high school credentials to adults. Plus, there is no other program doing it at near the low cost. Another thing we hear is AFLA is a low-performing program. If all WIOA programs were required to compute performance the way that AFLA does, AFLA would be the highest performing program under WIOA. Probably the biggest concern that we have is that CTE can be a substitute for AFLA. And by the way, I love CTE. 60% of the learners that are served in the AFLA program in adult education are below the 8th grade equivalency level, meaning they don't have the skills to access most CTE programs. If AFLA goes away and CTE is the substitute, there would be no federally funded educational services available for the adults most in need of education and literacy services, which is a primary emphasis under WIOA to serve the most in need. In summary, the literacy rate in America continues to decline, as we know from the most recent data from the Adult Skills Survey that indicates nearly 60 million adults. We've had the biggest decline that we've ever had since the U.S. has been participating in this survey in the 90s. 28% of adults in the country are at the lowest level of literacy, which equates to nearly 60 million adults. So it's a time when we should be investing more in adult education and literacy, not eliminating it. We hope that Congress maintains funding for adult education and provides a specific line item in the 2026 appropriations bill, like they did in the August appropriations bill the Senate passed for HHS, labor, and ed, in that bill where they articulated specifically the amount that will go to adult education as opposed to grouping it with a bunch of accounts. We hope that it's articulated specifically for adult ed. And with that, I'm sure I'm over time, but sorry. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you, Jeff. And I think we'll dive right into questions. And please feel free to throw your questions into the Q&A. I don't see any there yet, but I'll start with the question for the whole group. There's a lot of talk about, there's no layoffs until January 30th, but then after that, who knows? So I'm curious if any of you want to talk about what the impact would be in your programs if the employees of the Department of Ed are laid off and another department, presumably labor, is in charge of the program. Go ahead, Braden.
I'm very concerned about possible layoffs and that would make it not impossible. It would make it very difficult to move these programs back to the Department of Education. So a wait and see attitude, I can understand it to some extent, but it can be very dangerous if these employees are sent to labor, laid off, and replaced by DOL employees. It's going to be very hard to extract these programs from labor.
If I could, I'll just follow along with that. I think that especially for rural, the program administration isn't just about moving money. It's about the mechanics that keeps districts functioning, which allow for issuing timely allocations and interpreting allowable use, monitoring of compliance, resolving audit questions, those kinds of things, and that providing of technical assistance when something goes sideways. So if that expertise walks out the door during a transition, the predictable result, I think, is going to be delayed guidance and inconsistent answers and some slower problem solving. And in rural districts, they're going to feel that first because we don't have a grant office or a legal team to absorb that confusion. It might be just one person that's already carrying those federal programs forward. And so when federal help slows down, it's going to take away time from students, and that impact really does show up pretty quickly.
Okay, Melissa, and as long as we're on that, The president's 2026 budget zeroed out the 220 million rural education program and said its purpose could be covered by a new block grant that had 4.5 billion less than its consolidated programs have now. With ED moving administration for rural educational labor and keeping some other programs that support rural school students at ED, including special education, will move in Indian Ed Interior, how all these changes affect small rural districts?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I hear that, I think it's important to really name what's happening for rural districts, and it's not just one change. It's the stacking of three moving parts that all hit at the same spot in rural systems, which is capacity. So first, the president's FY26 budget proposal zeroes out REAP, the Rural Education Achievement Programs, and that's $22 million that supports SRSA and RLIS. And for rural districts, that isn't extra. It's flexible funding that often keeps interventions going or keeps positions whole, that type of thing. So REAP is one of the most flexible federal funding sources remaining, and it's essential, but obviously pretty vulnerable. The second is that the budget points towards replacing targeted programs with a new simplified block grant structure that, by multiple analyses that we've done, comes in at about 4.5 billion less than programs being consolidated now. And even if it's framed as being more flexible, the rural reality is that flexibility at the top can mean unpredictability at the bottom. And when programs are rolled together, rural needs end up being competing inside state priorities, and those districts don't always win. And it's not because the need isn't real in rural communities, but it's because rural systems are smaller and therefore less visible. And third, and I think that this gets underestimated, Ed is moving administration for many of the programs, obviously, to other agencies, with a major share going to Department of Labor and Indian education moving to the Interior. And people may assume that that's just a back office change, but in rural America, we communicate with that office on a consistent basis, like I said, with one person that's doing all of that work. And so it becomes an obstacle course. It's not streamlining for them. In Indian education, I want to speak just one more truth, and that is that consultation and continuity matter, and tribal leaders have already expressed concerns to us about confusion and disruption if responsibilities shift without clear planning and trusted experience. And in rural places, districts and tribal communities are often deeply intertwined. So the bottom line is that for rural schools, stability isn't just a luxury. It is really a necessity.
Hey, thank you. Next question for Victor. Student aid was dramatically cut in this year's reconciliation bill, with some funding going from minority serving institutions and transferred to HBCUs and TCUs. Do you anticipate that running such a dramatically larger program will be more complicated and could require more technical and other support? And do you anticipate that the Department of Labor staff have the background infrastructure to administer these programs well?
Great question. So, the additional funds that were well, first I'll say as a side tangent, I think it highlights the importance of making sure that a appropriations bill is passed for labor age, that those funds were allowed to be transferred from HSI to HBCUs. So we appreciate the funds. We needed the funds, but that's not something that we asked for. And the hope is that if we can have have an actual appropriations bill passed, then we could make sure that that type of thing doesn't happen again. The additional funds that we did receive, our schools have 1 year to use those funds, as opposed to typical Title III dollars, where they can have up to 10 years to use them. And lots of times schools use that funding for construction and planning and different things, and there's regulations around those funds, and they have a limited time to use them. And so I think that having folks there who don't know the specifics, you don't have any time to get caught up, because those funds have to be spent by September 30th of 2026. And so we appreciated those funds, but if there are issues around staff not knowing how those funds should be spent, or if there are issues with communications and causing of delays, and those funds are not able to be allocated in time, and that investment does go for naught. As I mentioned before, that we have been communicated from the department that in writing that will not be the case, and all we can do is take their word and go with that, and hope that is the case, because it is critical, as it is for all of our programs, that the folks who have expertise remain in place so that they can make sure that the trains still run on time.
Okay, thank you. Next question is for Kay. You mentioned that many offices at ED involved in calculating the formulas for Title I funds. ED's already lost half its staff this year. What types of problems can you foresee with some of the executive staff still at ED, funds flowing through the Department of Labor mechanisms, and far fewer staffers familiar with the program? What do you think might happen on July 1st when the bulk of fiscal 26 funding for Title I is due to be dispersed?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think that it remains to be seen what happens on July 1st. Assuming all of the data becomes available, and that's a big if, but I mentioned, data from census, data from states for N&D, data from HHS for foster kids, and the SPPE data that we need. I believe that assuming there's enough staff left, they can run the formula as they have in the past and make money available on July 1st. They operated it successfully during COVID, all remotely. And so, but that doesn't mention the issues that have been raised by Braden and Jeff regarding accessing those funds. And because it would be through labor system, not through ed system with which grantees are familiar. I was told today that there only remain 6 people in the Title I staff that would be presumably moving to labor to do all of the monitoring and technical assistance and awarding of grants and everything that is entailed in operating an $18 billion program. And I think they're very concerned about the ability to do that in terms of making themselves available for states and districts to answer questions, to ensure that the funds are being used properly. I think that with Title I being the largest elementary and secondary education program, there's a great tendency by states and school districts, particularly school districts, to use those funds to benefit the general education population. Title I has provisions in it, most notably the supplement not supplant provision, to ensure that the funds are in fact over and above what are needed to basically operate a school and a school system. But without adequate supervision of those requirements, you can imagine what is likely to happen. Those monies will not be used for the lowest achieving children. They will be used to fill in gaps or to benefit all children within a system. Even in a school-wide program where you can use the money for all students in the school, the funds still have to be over and above what are necessary to operate that school.
Okay, thank you, Kay. Next up for Jeff. This summer, ED withheld adult education formula funding from states for several weeks before providing it, causing havoc. And then adult education was part of the first interagency agreement, so serves as an example of what happens when the administration of an education program is moved to non-education agency. Can you provide any other examples of some of the problems the switch has caused?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Like I said in my remarks, the main thing that has happened so far. It's too new, I think, for a lot of states have, when I reached out to state directors, a majority of the states said it's too new. It was implemented in late September, then the shutdown happened. They're waiting to get more guidance on exactly what, if anything, might change. There's been issue with communication and getting in contact with people to get certain technical issues resolved. But immediately following the transition was the shutdown. So there was no one available to address some of the issues. So it's hard to say, is this going to continue to happen in terms of not getting guidance and not getting the help that they need? We'll see. It seems as though since the shutdown has happened, that they are providing more webinars. One happened a couple weeks ago to address the payment system issues that several states were having in drawing down their funds from the new system under labor. That is certainly one of the impacts that has been seen early on in this transition is the problems with the drawing down the funds. They are trying to mitigate those issues and have been having more technical assistance and guidance webinars on that. In terms of, how AFLA programs might be affected and who to contact with certain issues and guidance needs. There's another webinar, a shop talk that they're doing tomorrow to help, again, address some of those issues that state directors have. We will see how that plays out. It's only been the second one, or it's the first one that they've had since this transition. So I'm going to participate in that and see how well the new system addresses some of the issues that states are having. But right now, we don't really know what the impact's going to be, just a fear, I guess, or a concern of how it might play out at this point.
Okay, thanks. And a question for Braden. CT was already intended to be aligned with the workforce development needs, but the funding is for schools and colleges, not for training. Like adult education and current technical ed was supposed to be part of the first interagency agreement, but the IIAs only last until someone lifts them. But once staff at ED is mostly gone, funding streams have moved to labor. How hard would it be to move it back to ED?
I think it would be very hard, and I don't want to sound alarmist, but we're running out of time. If Congress doesn't intervene in this next year's CR and make things right, we may be looking at a situation where half of ED's programs are at labor and no one's going to have the will or the means to get them back. Humpty Dumpty has been given a big shove by Linda McMahon, and we're looking for the Hill to help us out.
Okay, thank you. And a final question for all of you, and let's see if we can cut it down to 2 or 3 sentences tops. As the administration continues to issue executive orders and regulations dealing with education, at the same time Congress turns back to the fiscal 26 education funding bill, is there one key item you'd want as a takeaway about what you like to see or about the value of investments in education that the government needs to at least maintain? I'm not calling in anyone. It's up to you guys to step up here.
I'll go ahead and start. I guess my ask is pretty simple. Whatever else changes through executive action or regulatory shifts, maintaining the federal commitment to the people who deliver education. Because in rural America, staffing stability, I think, is the fastest path to student stability. And if we keep that steady, then rural schools can do the rest.
And I would just add that maintaining the federal commitment to education means maintaining the U.S. Department of Education and the programs in it, as opposed to dispersing them to all of these other agencies somehow in the name of efficiency.
Well, I still don't see any questions in the Q&A. I'm a little surprised. So unless someone else wants to add something, I'll turn it back to Sarah.
I'm happy to close out. I think this has been really informative and helpful. I think for me, a lot of the takeaways are that uh, we don't actually know how these interagency agreements are going to be implemented because there has not been a lot of information sharing so far. Adult ed and career technical education went first, and the transition to having them being administered by their agencies has not been smooth. The funding this year for a lot of programs, for a variety of different reasons, also was not smooth. Some programs were defunded, some, like as Victor mentioned, HBU suddenly got a huge extra amount of money but have very limited time to use it. Other programs had funding delayed and then ultimately provided, but we don't yet know that the money is flowing as it was supposed to. We don't yet know what funding will be provided for the coming year, and pretty soon colleges, school districts will need to know because they have to make their budgets. I fear that the chaos and uncertainty inevitably leads to less funding because grantees, institutions, states, if they can't count on the federal funding coming, they will build their budgets to not rely on it. And that means less funding. I also think that these interagency agreements, the administration said that the point was to, well, there's 2 points. One was they want to close the Department of Ed, and one is to return education to the states. And I'm putting air quotes without actually doing it around that, because in fact, I don't see how requiring state agencies or grantees to have to deal with tons of new administrative requirements or learn new systems or double the amount of work they have to do to get funding from 2 different agencies or 3 different agencies, how that does anything to support teaching and learning and support education or give more money to the states. It seems to me it's doing exactly the opposite. It's requiring them to jump through more hoops to get the same funding they might have gotten already. CEF is urging the Hill to stand up for its constitutionally guaranteed authority to enact education funding, and we hope that Congress will quickly enact a full-year labor HHS education appropriations bill that spells out funding for each program, that provides guardrails to keep the funding where the Congress intended when it passed these laws that the president will presumably sign, and that will abide by the authority that the statutes provide for these education programs, which is to be at the Department of Education. But mostly what we want is to make sure that the federal investment in education does what it was intended to do, which is to support teaching and learning, to help those who often are the ones who most need the help. The federal funding fills in where state or local or private funding isn't able to, for a variety of different reasons, accomplish those goals. So CEF will keep sending information out. We will have this briefing on our events webpage. I put the link to that in the chat, but it's cef.org/events. And I will reach out to everybody who registered and share some information. I've got a handy funding table that shows which programs are being, which are subject to interagency agreements to be managed by other agencies. And I will note that the Department of Ed has said this is just the first wave, that they want to do more. They have been talking since this administration was sworn in about moving, for instance, special ed to the Department of Health and Human Services. We know that there are others in the works. So I'm hopeful that people will not stand back and watch what happens, because once it has happened, it is very hard to unravel. And we want to make sure that this federal funds do what they were intended to. So with that, I want to thank all the participants for sharing your information. It was very helpful, and I appreciate all those who attended. And thanks for all. Bye, everyone.